Eagles are large birds. This is a large female here. They have wingspans of 6 to 8 feet, and there are consequences for body size, right? So there are a lot of things about their ecology that are sort of dictated by their body size. And here's an example of that. This is a nest up on the Rappahannock River, and most of their nests are large. And they're large because they need a large platform to raise 2 to 3 chicks. These chicks are large when they get to near fledging, and so they need quite a bit of space. And so these nests might be 6 to 8 feet across, some of them a little bit less than that. So it's a large structure. One of the things I'd like to point out here is that these are male and female. This is a male, this is a female. Because females reach a larger terminal size in development, they tend to put on feathers later. So you can come into a nest like this, one will be completely feathered out, the other one not so much. And it's because of the gender differences. So the males are able to divert energy to feather growth at an earlier age, and so you get this sort of asymmetry in the way that they live there. These chicks are off pouting in their own side of the nest, though, you can tell. So the nests are large, and this is a nest on the upper bay here in a willow oak. This is Craig Copey, who works with Fish and Life Service. He was out banding with us one day, and you can get some idea as to what the size is. Quite a trick, I can tell you, to climb over that nest structure there to get up in. But this was a huge tree here. So they require large trees to support the size of the nest that they need. Here's some other examples. This is an old graduate student of mine, Catherine Markin, and me. In her project, we put a lot of cameras in nests, did a lot of growth work and diet work, so we climbed a lot of trees. But it gives you some idea of the variation in nest structure and the size there. All these right here are on the James River. And so they require large trees, and here's some examples of that. So these are both trees on the James River, and you can see the nest up here. Fairly large nest. You might be able to see me right there. And this is Dana Bradshaw down at the base of the tree holding the climbing line. So these are not small trees. Here you can see me here. This is only about a third of this tree here. So they're fairly large trees to support that kind of nest structure. This nest here is about 8 feet across at the surface. So fairly sizable. I wanted to also mention that although the vast majority of nests that we have in the Chesapeake Bay are in trees, and in the lower bay it's lob bodies, and as you go up into the lower saline reaches of the bay, it turns to hardwood. But we do have other structures that are used. This is a tower up at Aberdeen Proving Ground, which has been used for years and years. It's a Monocacy tower, and here you can see the brood on that tower nest there. And so they are increasingly using human structures. In this particular property, there are 3 nests in towers like this, and we have a number of them throughout the bay on cell towers now, and also on transmission towers. So they're starting to adapt to some of these structures that we're seeing. Yeah, here's an unusual nest that's been here for about 4 years. This is on a little shack here on the eastern shore, and this particular shack is on Little Cobb Island. And this particular pair, there's no structure out there, there's no trees or anything, so they've decided to nest on this roof. And I flew over this nest this week, actually on Wednesday, and they have 1 chick there this year. So they seem to be doing okay. But that's a fairly large nest as well. And this is an unusual nest. This is out on Bloodsworth Island, which is just above Smith and Tangier Island, out in the middle of the bay in Maryland. And the Department of Defense put a number of platforms out on Bloodsworth for great blue herons, and this bald eagle pair, that's only about 10 feet off of the marsh there. It's a really low tower. So, and if you look at the nest, you can see it's driftwood. It's made out of driftwood. So, at any rate, substrate does vary a little bit. We're starting to see them use a number of different structures, and I'm sure that's going to continue. One of the other things besides trees that eagles need is an open foraging area, typically a peaceful foraging area away from disturbance. And this is the type of scene that we typically see that they like for that. And I wanted to say a little bit about diet. So this is a pair up on the York River, a couple of chicks, and it's a blue catfish, which was actually introduced in the bay in the late 60s. But anyway, about 95% of the prey that comes into nests here in the Chesapeake Bay is fish. The rest of it is typically aquatic oriented, but a huge portion that's provided to the chicks is fish. here's a nest up on the Potomac River, and I'll point out here what you already know from the Botanical Garden, that is, here's a fish here, but here's a gray squirrel. And so they eat these mammals quite a bit. We'll see squirrels, we see skunks occasionally. Occasionally I have found evidence of use of fawns, deer fawns, by eagles, and I've reviewed some papers on them feeding on deer fawns. But the most abundant mammal that they use, at least the most numerous that they use, is muskrat. So we see a lot of muskrat use, particularly in the Upper Bay, and it's one of the dominant mammals that they use. On 2 occasions I have found beaver skulls under nests, but they were small beavers. Beaver's a big animal. And here's a nest on the eastern shore, and this is typical here in the Bay. These adults will absolutely pile food into the nest, so food can be super abundant in the nest in a particular development stage for the chicks. And you can see the diversity here. This is a striper. I'm not sure what species of fish these are, but one of the things that I want you to notice is that there are actually 6 diamondback terrapin shells here. There's one, there's one, here, here, and here. So it's a species of turtle that is associated with salt water, and this particular pair seem to love them. And over about a 4-year period, I went to a lot of nests and collected turtle shells to look at the species they were using. Most of them use mud turtles. Here's a box of turtle shells that were collected from eagle nests. So they use quite a bit of turtles, but different pairs seem to have a taste for them. You'll go to one nest and there might be 15 turtle shells. You'll go to other ones, there won't be any. So it seems to vary pair to pair as to who likes the turtles. I wanted to mention too that the nests in a territory move around over time. And here's an example of that. This is a territory. This shows a 40-year history of this pair's movement on the Potomac River. And I wanted to mention that this particular property was owned by John Dos Passos, who was an American novelist. He died in the late 1960s. But this was his house here, and he owned all of this property here, and he absolutely loved the eagles. And his children still own the house, and they still will not sell this land because of this pair of eagles. And so that's the type of families that you hope to run into, you know. But why is it that they move around over time? Actually, about 30% of our pairs move annually. And here's one example of that. This is Mitchell bird looking into a nest that's been blown down. But what happens oftentimes is that these nests are struck by lightning and killed. And once they die, the pair occasionally will move, or they'll stay with that nest until it falls over, more rarely. And this particular pair stayed with this nest. This is at Plum Point up near West Point on the York. And in a spring storm, while this bird was incubating, we had flown the nest and the bird was incubating. About 2 days later, a storm came through and snapped this tree off because it was dead. So we know the bird had eggs, and so Mitchell was in here looking around for eggshell fragments this day. Another reason that they leave nests is raccoons. This is Catherine. About 2 days before, we had flown this nest and there were eggs in it. So we went in to put some camera equipment in. She got up here and met this raccoon, you can see here. And she got up there, the raccoon started to come down, neither one of them knew what to do. So finally, this raccoon jumped over her onto the trunk here and went on down to the ground and ran off. But raccoons take over about 2 to 3% of our nests annually. And they'll actually live in the nest. They'll burrow down into the center of it. We'll fly over and they'll stick their head up out of the hole there in the middle of the nest and look around. But they actually use the nest structure to burrow in and live there. And they'll have their own young within the nest. And we've also had some raccoons eat chicks all the way up to 8 weeks of age. We don't have a lot of documentation on how many chicks they take. All right, horned owls is another reason. Horned owls don't make their own nest. They'll nest in other species' nests, like red-tailed hawks or osprey or crows. But one of the species that they use is bald eagles, and each year we lose about 3 to 5% of our nests to horned owls annually. And so we'll fly over the nest and the horned owl will be incubating or have chicks. And we've documented cases where we've had eagles incubating, and then a week later or so we have horned owls incubating. So for whatever reason, even though they're considerably smaller, they have a nighttime advantage and they are able to actually take over nests, we believe. So in terms of requirements, they need adequate nesting substrate with good crown access. We didn't mention that, but they like isolated trees that have access to the crown because eagles are large. They also need a large habitat patch for nesting with disturbance-free buffers in close proximity to large water bodies. And they also need disturbance-free foraging habitat, and typically with ample prey. So those are the main requirements that we see for the eagles. I wanted to mention something about the history of the population and some of the constraints that we've seen over time. I'm sure you're familiar with DDT and how it caused the population to decline, but I want to mention some of the earlier constraints that we believe have affected the population over time. And the first one of those is land clearing. You know, when we colonized the lower bay, we started to clear land for agriculture, and that continued for a considerable period, reaching a height in about the 1880s. And here you can see that. From pollen cores here, we can see that by about 1840, almost 50% of the landscape was completely cleared in the bay. That actually continued through the Civil War, and I'll show you some pictures of that, and reached well over 50%. So the forest was actually cleared. Here's an example of that. So this is a Civil War picture of Yorktown. And look at the horizon here. It's an open bald. It's like an open grassland. This is Jamestown Island looking across the thoroughfare toward Williamsburg in the Civil War era. You can see it's been cleared. This is Petersburg, one of the forts in Petersburg. You can see some scattered trees out through here, but not many. And this is just on the outside of Richmond. And so it's something that we don't think about these days because we've had secondary succession, the forest has come back, but we had a huge clearing period from about the mid-1850s to about the 1920s where most of the east was open grassland. And one of the best indicators of that I know of is that in Bailey's book, which was written in 1913, he mentions that on the peninsula meaning Newport News up to Williamsburg, which is where he lived, and bird watched a lot, that in 15 years, he only had 5 records of blue jays. That's something that we can't imagine today, but it's because there weren't any forests for blue jays to be in. So that's how dramatic the deforestation was at that period. And the relevance today is that there was a bottleneck. There was a bottleneck in tree availability for that early 1900s period. And we still see the evidence of that today. This is what I refer to as a survivor. This is a tree in Charles City County. And it's a huge tree. It's probably 200 years old. So this tree existed during the Civil War. It's one of the survivors of that era. And these survivors are huge trees, and they're the ones that are sought out by bald eagles for nesting habitat. This particular tree is like the grandfather to this patch here. If you walk into it, it has a huge base. Here you can see the nest on the top of it. This is a huge nest, but it doesn't look that huge in this big tree. So these are survivors. These are the type of trees that eagles are sort of seeking out for nesting. Here's another example of this. This is up in the upper bay. This is a white oak. You can see the base of it here. I'm getting ready to climb up to a nest there. There's been a nest in this tree for years. But interestingly, we believe that there was a nest in this tree in the mid-30s when Brian Terrell surveyed eagles in the Chesapeake Bay, and he describes a nest, we believe, in this tree. And so this is a tree that's very long-lived, and it likely had eagles in the early 1900s. There was a gap there when the population declined, and now it's had another pair of eagles nesting for maybe 20 years or so in it. So there are some survivors out there from that time period, and eagles really are attracted to those trees. So there was this period of land clearing. There was a period, these were occurring all through this time period, but in terms of their zenith, in terms of their impact with the bald eagle population, we sort of entered into a new period here of shooting and collecting. Eagles were shot routinely throughout the bay. They were considered to be competitors. They also took chickens and other things, livestock from farms, and so they weren't considered friendly to most of the residents, and so they were shot routinely. Brian Terrell talks about coming into a house on the eastern shore of Maryland and going into the living room, and there were marks on the mantle there. And he said, "What are the marks?" And they were marks of the wingspan of all the eagles that they had shot. So they put the wingspan there and marked the widths of those spans there. So it was routine at that time. Not so much now. This is an old picture. I took this when I was an undergrad, and I worked at the Tucson Wildlife Research Center. We had 4 birds come in shot from one county in the eastern shore of Maryland in 1 month, and this was one of those birds. This bird turned out to be an amputee, and the other ones were dead. But anyway, shooting was much more common even during that period than it is now. I'm sure that Ed still gets birds to the Wildlife Center that are shot occasionally, but it's not nearly as widespread and common as it was at one time in this region.
you mind if I record and post video from today on YouTube?
Yeah, that'd be fine.
Thank you.